Okay, we'll get started. Hi, welcome, Bula, as they say here. Welcome very much to our side event. I'm the Executive Director, my name is Margaret-Ann Splawn, the Executive Director of the Climate Markets and Investment Association. We are a not-for-profit trade association. We are comprised of private sector companies actively involved and participating in climate finance and investment. One of the things that's slightly unique to us is that we hold 3 private sector observer roles at 3 large funds that disperse funding for countries to stop deforestation, as well as at the Green Climate Fund, which is the only fund designed to disperse designed specifically for climate finance. We also hold the private sector observer role at the Forest Carbon Partnership Facility, as well as at the Forest Investment Program, which is held in trust. Both funds are held in trust at the World Bank. So today we're here talking about building trust in REDD+ to scale up finance. Now, funnily enough, on the agenda today, there's not really much in at COP23 about forests, because it was included in 2015, so it's pretty much done and dusted, isn't it? But not really, because to date we've only seen about 3 billion dispersed to date into funding specifically for REDD+, and so our panel today is comprised of experts, and we wanted to talk about building trust to scale up the finance, and also to discuss one of the papers that the chair, Christina Elvers, and her colleague Roberta Ely, who are also the chairs of our Land Use and Forestry Working Group, recently wrote in coordination with CDKN. We have the chief executive here of CDKN as well, to talk about applying accountancy principles to help build trust and confidence within REDD+. So I'm going to hand over. We've got a great panel here today. I'm going to introduce Sam Bickersteth. He's the Chief Executive of the Climate and Development Knowledge Network, and is based actually in PwC in London. CDKN, for those of you who don't know, is funded by DFID and the Dutch government, and has been supporting decision makers in developing countries in the design and delivery of climate-compatible development over the past 7 years. Sam spent 30 years working on international development with a focus on livelihoods, agriculture, forestry, and climate change challenges across Africa, Asia, and Latin America. His experience with working with DFID, Oxfam, and PwC has included working to bring better engagement and trust between public, private, and community-level forest stakeholders. And quickly on the panel as well, we've got first Lisa Walker, who's the CEO of Ecosphere Plus. She's going to deliver the private sector view as she's part of the Athelia Climate Fund group, and give the perspective of a climate fund that has been very successful at building up REDD+. We've got Christina Elvers working at PwC in the climate change division. We've got next is Christopher Webb of the Nature Conservancy, and at the very end we've got Angelo Sartori of the Chilean Forestry unit, and he'll talk about that. But Sam, if you want to come up and give some introduction remarks.
I think I'm going to sit here, if you don't mind. I think everyone hopefully can see us all on the panel. Well, thank you very much for coming along this afternoon. It's very kind of you to find the time and find the place, but what a beautiful place it is, and thanks to the government of Fiji for this facility. We're here really, I think we're all here because we're committed to wanting to make REDD+ work and scale up and find forest solutions to climate change. And we've put the word trust in the title, and I'm happy to have a debate about what that means on the basis of the paper that we produced in CDKN. But over the 7 years that I've been leading CDKN, essentially in the whole climate space, it's been about building trust. We've done that through improving the knowledge base. You do need to understand what the challenges are, whether it's from the science or the economics or the impacts. We've spent a lot of time and effort in CDKN bringing stakeholders together, brokering that knowledge, whether it's the scientists, the policymakers, national or local government or private sector. And of course, in doing that, we've supported the improvement of capabilities to respond to both the challenges of climate change and the opportunities. And clearly, forest management is one of those. We've done this with some success in managing extreme heat in India. We started in one city and are now 30 cities in India with active heat management plans. And I think the scaling up, the way in which the NDCs and some of the really high quality NDCs, particularly coming from Andean countries, are a process of where those stakeholders came together to build trust. And I think I don't need to tell you that if 1/3 of global emissions are coming from land use change, we can all assume at least 1/3 of the solution lies in that sector. We know really that we don't need new technologies, we just need good management and opportunities to drive the scaling up of forest management. I spend quite a lot of time going to conferences and people talk about BECCS. If we work on the assumption that we're going to head for a 2 degrees overshoot, nearly all the models have BECCS, bioenergy carbon capture and storage, in the model. Well, look out there, folks, for the technologies, but there's one technology I know, which is restoring and managing forests. That's the best negative emissions technology that's out there, so why don't we get on with it? So essentially, this is the contribution that we're trying to make here to accelerate this process through a proposal around engaging more stakeholders to enhance trust, investment and activity. And it's a real pleasure to be part of this. And with that, I'm going to hand on to my colleague Christina to expand on the paper she's led on.
Christina, would you give an overview of what the paper is about? And because the paper was just released at COP, can you tell us how it came about? What the thinking was behind it? I've read it. I think it's a great paper. And could you share with the audience of what your intention was and why this came about?
I will be happy to. So if we look at the sustainable land use space, you see that we've got private sector actors and public sector actors. So on the one hand, you've got your zero net deforestation companies, you've got your REDD Plus project developers, and then you've got your big REDD Plus donors, such as Norway or the UK or Germany. And then, of course, you've got your tropical forested countries who a lot of this attention is, focused on. And I think it's safe to say that all these actors might have slightly different approaches, but they all share a common goal, which is to stop deforestation. And I don't think I have to tell this audience that that's obviously badly needed, because we've lost forests the size of South Africa since 1990. And we will need tens of billions in order to halt or even reverse this. And REDD Plus is kind of a ready-made solution for this. It's been agreed, as Margaret-Ann said, by the UNFCCC. We've got the Warsaw Framework, and we've got a lot of donors who've put quite a lot of money into this. For example, there's the Forest Carbon Partnership Facilities, which has got 700 million ready to be dispersed in results-based payments. However, private sector money really hasn't flown at the scale that we needed and that we need for this to be transformational. Now, why is this? Well, we argue it's because there is a lack of trust in the system. And where does this lack of trust come from? A lot of it, in our opinion, comes from early teething problems with REDD Plus, which were kind of showcased very publicly, for example, around permanence and leakage. And that led to a few perceptions around REDD Plus, and we've kind of identified three. The first one is that REDD Plus systems are extremely complex and people don't understand them. The second is that people are really concerned about environmental and social robustness in REDD Plus. And then finally, people are actually not sure if REDD Plus achieves results on the ground. All of this led to a few stakeholders who might have been, might have been interested in REDD Plus at first to take a step back, and in particular, private sector actors. But we think now is actually a crucial time, and that REDD Plus could be vitalized. Again, as you will know, the Green Climate Fund just released its 500 million pilot on REDD Plus results-based payments, and the aviation industry is looking to include REDD Plus in its CORSIA mechanism. But we don't think all of this will really happen unless trust is built. All right, so what's our solution? Well, coming from an accounting firm, PwC, you might not be surprised to hear that we looked at financial markets. because financial markets really rely on trust. Without trust, they just wouldn't function and collapse. So how do they do it? Well, it's actually relatively simple. They have a common approach to reporting and accounting, which is the financial reporting principles. And they all have subscribed to these and adhere to these. And so what does that mean for me? Well, it means if I pick up an annual report by a company, I A, understand what it's trying to tell me, and B, I can trust that what's in it is accurate, in particular if it's audited by someone like PwC. So we took these principles and applied them to REDD Plus accounting. And we found 3 solutions that we think will help build trust, and I'll talk about these briefly as well. So firstly, in financial accounting, the information must be tailored to and be relevant to the end user. So as I said, I need to be able to do something with that information to make a decision. In REDD Plus, that would mean that the actors need to collect data that's relevant for all stakeholders. So not just, for example, for a donor, but also for a zero deforestation company. And Costa Rica is already doing that. So they're overlaying remote sensing data that they're gathering for carbon with land registry information of pineapple farmers. And what that gives you is, if you are a buyer of pineapple, a big company, you suddenly know which of these pineapple farmers is actually adhering to the zero deforestation. And that increases trust, because suddenly this buyer, who is very far removed from REDD Plus, understands the data that comes out of REDD Plus. Secondly, in financial accounting, the data provided has to be robust, transparent, and auditable. And REDD Plus accounting does adhere to some of this, but we would say what's really important that all key data is collected, that it's independently verified, and on top, we would actually suggest a third-party ratings agency, again, as you have in financial accounting, where people can go to and understand, is this good data, is this bad data? And then finally, the financial accounting principles have actually led to a standardized and harmonized approach in financial accounting. And that is sorely lacking in REDD Plus. There are so many frameworks and standards that nobody really understands them. They're incredibly complex and they're a burden on REDD Plus countries, let alone private investors who just don't understand them. So we say with a common system, you cut through all of this complexity, you make the data more accessible, and again, that increases trust. Right, so I know there are a multitude of reasons for why finance is not flowing at scale, but we truly believe that trust is one of them, and we think our idea will help solve that. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you very much. Before we open up for questions, I'd like all of our panelists to speak. And I'd actually like Lisa Walker, the CEO of Ecosphere Plus, to give us your perspective from the project developer perspective. Many REDD Plus project developers would argue that they've done very well on building trust, and you particularly have with REDD Plus countries they operate in. But what can the wider community learn from this? And I know you're also looking at options to scale up REDD Plus. Is trust an issue in this?
Thanks, Margaret-Ann, and thank you, Christina and Sam, for the paper, which we definitely welcome. So thanks for that. So I'm going to talk about trust from the perspective, and building confidence really from the perspective of supply and demand, because often in REDD Plus we talk a lot about supply, but we sometimes forget the D word, which is demand. And I love what Sam said. I couldn't agree more with the oldest technology in the world, photosynthesis, for storing and safely storing and capturing carbon. So that's great. So firstly on that, why is supply important? Sam, you said this as well, 37% of the emissions cuts that we need can come from this sector. And there was a great report published a couple of weeks ago by TNC and PNAS, which said, there's 2 gigatons of potential at less than $10 a ton from avoiding forest conversion. To put that into perspective, that's the equivalent of taking 600 million cars off the road annually. So supply is important, and we have to get this right. I'm the CEO of Ecosphere Plus. We're part of the Althelia Climate Fund. That's really a group of pioneering impact investors early into the space in REDD+. And have invested into a portfolio of projects around the world and really worked collaboratively at building trust at multiple levels. So starting bottom up, what's really, really important is our long-term community engagement on the ground. We provide finance to local NGO groups who have had long experience working within the communities, including Indigenous communities in the areas that we operate. Each community that wants to participate in the program is guided through a full participatory planning process. They have long-term certainty, which is important for their trust, at least a 10-year contract, and obviously they're part of the process in terms of determining what do they want to do with this investment. And oftentimes we find that, in fact, the choices are around sustainable development goals, healthcare, education, women's clinics, etc. And beyond financial assistance, communities are also receiving technical assistance, agroforestry, conservation, forest protection, etc. The Althelia Climate Fund model, we don't just invest in the emissions reductions, we also invest in the sustainable commodity production. So, for example, as well as financing the emissions reduction, giving a long-term sustainable sort of landscape transition for the community by growing cacao or coffee in the buffer zone of protected areas as one example. And that, there we get to a sort of a longer term and we would hope permanent shift in that landscape. Christina mentioned, the robustness of environmental and social safeguards. I think that the REDD+ standards that we do have proved successful and technically sound over 10 years of their use. We don't rely just on those standards. We also have our own ESG standards. We're an impact fund with public and private money invested in it, the likes of the European Investment Bank, the Dutch Development Bank. So we have to have very high standards and conform to the Development Bank standards in any case. But our ESG standards make sure that they're fully aligned with the IFC performance standards. And we have FPIC and other safeguarding mechanisms built into them. We also make sure that we measure and track not only the carbon emissions reductions, but we have KPIs that target a range of sustainable development areas, whether that's job creation, livelihoods, number of people or families supported, high conservation value, habitat, watershed protection, etc. And I think being, really careful to set targets and to measure and track progress publicly is also really important. I think that your paper said that as well. So that's supply. I think we need to talk about demand as well. It is my favorite topic. It's clear to me today that there's a general sort of lack of trust in anything that puts a price on carbon generally. I mean, given the fact there's a carbon derivative to every single decision, every choice we make today, there should be a huge amount of transparency generally in carbon pricing and a giant carbon market that does not exist. We know that. And it's not just about donors, buyers, and sellers. If we're going to expect to price sufficiently payments for ecosystem services, however we do that, whether that's results-based payments or REDD+ and a carbon market or an offsetting scheme for Corsair or whatever, then we need to have trust. I think that there's evidence that consumers are moving in a sort of greener direction, particularly millennials, but there isn't really yet a mechanism for them to trust that brands are doing the right thing. There is some interesting examples, like Christina mentioned, but that's not really happening at scale. A part of it for us was how do you align the point of pollution, if you like, with the point of sale in a carbon pricing or payment for ecosystem model. And that's where I'm quite excited about new digital technologies like blockchain and also, in combination with things like smart wallets that I think can actually build trust. Blockchain is designed through a public ledger to build trust in any kind of financial transaction, and we've found that actually in piloting in our own portfolio, it can build trust both in the upstream, if you like, so how we're we're investing, tracking, measuring, verifying, certifying, financing projects or programs of activity, but also actually at the retail level. So we've been piloting through a new venture that we're involved with called Poseidon, with point of sale activities, so that, you know, one day soon, I think, we could have our cup of coffee and not only wonder, is it deforestation free, which is often a challenge to understand today, and it's no wonder there's a lack of interest in REDD+, but actually with these kinds of technologies, not only could we be confident that it's deforestation free, it could be forest positive. And the cost when you disaggregate this and put a small price out there across millions of products, is less than 1 cent. We probably wouldn't even notice, but we would have confidence and trust that we're doing the right thing and we're on track. So that's it for me, really. So just, you know, we have to worry about confidence in supply and demand. I think we need to work collaboratively at all levels. And I would say, I just wanted to highlight that we have a huge amount of technical expertise on the CMIA Land Use Working Group. We're personally working in Peru with the government to see how our early projects can appropriately nest into the national system. We think it's really important that there's recognition and reward for inclusive activities at all levels, and that there is a paper by the CMIA Land Use Working Group. We've got some copies here with more technical details on how we think the principles of nesting could work. So thank you.
Thank you. Thanks so much, Lisa. It's super interesting. Very interesting to hear from the private sector view, which is why it's great to have Angelo, I'm going to mispronounce your name, Sartori, from Chile, representing really the government point of view. And Chile has been quite successful in involving the private sector, but do you think that there's a lack of trust in REDD+, and what are your views, and what have you done as a government to involve the private sector? Could you share your insights there?
Okay, thank you very much of the organizer to invite me to participate. I'm very happy to this document. I hope in the future we can translate to Spanish, because it will be very useful to show to our local private sector in Chile. To start, I would like to do a little context of our REDD+ situation in our country. We are working from several years ago about this concept from the government. I work directly to the Chilean Forest Service, and I am the national focal point of REDD+ in Chile. And at the moment we are working very close with the FCPF initiative that you know that involves in the donors part of the FCPF the international private sector. And we are working right now with a very advanced level related to the carbon fund initiative of the FCPF associated to the payment by results. So here I want to explain that maybe if you think in the private sector, we have to separate the private sector, because we have a private sector that know very well issues related to climate change and REDD+. But normally in our countries, there are a lot of private companies that don't know a lot related to this kind of issues. So this situation, more than a lack of trust, generate a problem to understand very well what it means REDD+ context in relation to the convention scope that we established here related to REDD+. What happened here, for example, we are talking normally with a very difficult and very technical language to the private sector related to the REDD+. The people normally don't understand what mean reference level, MRB system, register system. You have to achieve the safeguard. It's very complex to a private sector, so you have to understand very well the language that you have to use when we are trying to establish some agreement with this sector, the agreement between the public and the private sector. But in our opinion, there is, in some cases, a lack of trust, and we think the principal origin of this lack of trust is related to the old REDD Plus project that in some cases were carried out by the voluntary carbon market. That, you know, is very different, the scope related to the REDD Plus concept that we carry out here in the convention, where a national entity, a local government entity, have to support the REDD national strategy. But in some cases, not all the projects related to the voluntary carbon market show some problems, in some cases illegal problems, for example, with the local communities related to the land tenure. Yeah, and you know, the bad news are more quickly spread in the press than the new ones. So in this case, some people had the confused about this specific situation in the past related with the initiative that the government had carried out right now related to the REDD Plus strategies. Yeah? I think this is the principal driver related to the lack of trust of REDD Plus, but it's only confused that you have to explain right now much better, and to explain that right now we have here a government institution that support all the activities that the Warsaw framework have to complete for each developing countries. Another point that I want to ask to your guideline question is about the link that we have already with the private sector in our country. From, I think, 5 years ago, we started work very close and hard with the private sector, mainly with 3 or 4 sector that represent the private sector in our country. The principal one is related to the minery of copper and gold. Obviously, in our country, we have a lot of production related to this kind of enterprise, and they use land. So, you know, when enterprise use land, they have a different view related to the forest, because the forests are present in these areas. The another sector that we have some specific agreements is related to the wine production. You know, Chile produce a lot of wine. Also with the forest sector, we have a very huge private sector in our country related to exotic plantation, principally pine and eucalyptus. And in another case, we are starting right now some conversation related to the aviation sector. And here we have a very specific situation, because as you mentioned about the CORSIA initiatives, so we are waiting that REDD can be included in this sector, because we think this agreement will provide a very specific financial instrument that is possible to invest in the forest and to avoid the driver of deforestation and forest degradation in our country. But only to end, I have 3 points that is very useful in our case to involve and to include in this kind of agreement the public sector with the private sector. The first one is to speak their language. It's not possible to go to a private enterprise, and to talk very technical from the definition that normally we use here in this kind of convention related to climate change and REDD Plus. The second one is to understand very well the needs of the private sector. Yeah? Normally they have needs that it's very easy for the public sector to understand, but you have to spend time to understand very well, in deep, what kind of thing they need that the public sector provide in this kind of initiative that are supported by international scope, in this case, REDD Plus. And in the end, you know, all the countries, we have to develop and to validate a national REDD Plus strategy, and we have to follow the called safeguard. The safeguard include the participatory level of local communities, academic, another public sector, but obviously the private sector. So when you start these participatory initiatives to elaborate the national REDD Plus strategy, obviously you need to begin with the private sector in the very early step of the elaboration of the national REDD Plus strategy, included all the sectors that you think are very interesting to work in this kind of initiative. So I think these 3 points are the main recommendation that we have in our own experience to include the private sector in our country. Thank you.
Very interesting, Angelo, to hear about that, and it's nice to see you again, and nice to follow up on and hear the progress that Chile continues to make. Next, we're going to hear from Christopher Webb from the Nature Conservancy, and the Nature Conservancy has been investing in forest conservation for decades. Now, TNC has an interesting role in this space because while it isn't a typical private sector organization, it's also isn't just a donor. Yet it has invested in the Forest Carbon Partnership Facility. So it isn't representing developing countries, but it works with them in a way that's quite different to donor countries. We'd like to hear from you, Chris, on where and between who there's a lack of trust. You've got an extensive background in this space and also representing the views of TNC. Very, very interested to hear what your take is on lack of trust.
Thanks, Margaret-Ann. Good afternoon. So really there's a sort of theme about what I want to talk about, which is around collectively owned action and around, related to that, the role of individuals rather than institutions. So as I was starting to think about what I might say today, I sort of didn't start with REDD+, and I'd like you to do the same. So take yourself out of the kind of REDD+ sustainable land use world, take yourself out of even the climate change world. And if you look at who society trusts today versus 30 years ago, it's changed dramatically. People used to trust large organizations and institutions. Governments and corporations nowadays are trusted in the kind of low 10% by society writ large. But who do we trust? We've created trust in a very different way. Think about how you buy something on eBay, or when you're visiting somewhere on holiday, booking your Airbnb here. So this kind of crowdsourced idea of kind of collective wisdom through peers. So as I sort of stepped back, I was thinking a little bit about technology as an enabler, and I'll come back to that. There is a flip side to that, which is that social media, the internet, bad news travels fast, and that bad news, in the words of somebody maybe I shouldn't ever mention, could be fake news. So there's a double-edged sword to that technology as an enabler. So I wanted to give a couple of examples of what we've learned from working in decades in this space, issuing some of the first project-level credits, and working with many of you on the journey, working on jurisdictional programs now, and why I'm actually really hopeful for the future. The first is when you meet somebody from the Nature Conservancy, they will often talk about how everything we do is rooted in science. More than 10% of our staff are scientists, working in partnership with other academic institutions and other NGO partners to enhance the evidence base. And if I reflect on the sort of sustainable land use narrative, even today, it's been a pretty confused and confusing one. If we think about just that we've heard on this panel, the journey from project level to subnational to national, what's right, what's wrong in different circumstances. How does something like REDD+ play against food security? We heard again around the BECS. The role of forests as a source, as a sink. So the paper that Lisa mentioned previously was TNC really wanted to try and enhance the evidence base that there is here. So we worked for 2 years with 15 academic and other NGO partners to produce a peer-reviewed journal that was issued just a month ago that tried to aggregate the latest science on what is the role that nature can play as a climate solution at scale and in a cost-effective way. And that's where the 37% number that Lisa talked about came from. So Sam mentioned then how that relates to the 2% of climate finance that it's got to date, so the 37 and the 2. But we need to keep enhancing this evidence base. That narrative is not yet coherent yet. The IPCC 1.5 degree report, the special reports coming out next year are really important opportunities, so I think we need to keep plugging away at that. The other thing that's really important in the paper that was released is it's very transparent about what we don't know, and it's very honest about what we don't know. So it talks about the role that nature can have, but is very explicit and puts numbers around how confident we are in some of those numbers. And I think in the past we haven't necessarily been perhaps as transparent as an ecosystem around what we know and what we don't know. And we also really recognise that NGOs have an opportunity to lower that level of confusion. So one of the things that we've been working on, and it's something that will hopefully be announced the next couple of days at the COP, is starting to work in alliance with our peers as NGOs to come together under one sort of narrative and evidence base around the role of nature as a climate solution at scale. So a little plea, if there are any NGOs in the audience or you know of others that would kind of love to come and join, this is not about TNC, this is a bigger global challenge that needs all of us to come together, and we can help collectively by doing so reducing some of that confusion. The second point, and I'll be quick, it was coming back to that sort of peer-to-peer networks of trust, the TripAdvisor, the eBay. As we think about where we've been most successful on the ground, our REDD Plus projects evolved jurisdictional programs, and the most successful took the further step to become what we called green growth compacts, but they're essentially about local stakeholders, relevant to a certain place, creating locally derived, agreed solutions. From that, there's a sort of 7-step process that I'm more than happy to go into, but I won't sort of at this point of how to bring people together. And it was that sort of got me thinking about the link between our work on the ground with communities, with stakeholders, that includes the private sector, with governments, around breaking down the sort of institutional barriers and creating new trusted relationships based on individuals and peers, and whether there was something in the role of technology, what we can learn maybe from business models like TripAdvisor and eBay and others. The FCPF has been mentioned. Trust has been built in that group, but it's 8 or 10 years. So what tools or lessons can we kind of learn to accelerate that from some other sectors? The last thing I'm going to mention is certainly something around keeping it simple. REDD has got extraordinarily complicated. I've counted that, I think, 3 times already. Seems to be a common theme. There's a lot of conversations going on right now talking about transparency. And my sort of nervousness is that we're going to become really transparent about what is still incomprehensible. So we need to also tackle the incomprehensible nature of this diverse, divergent, complex landscape of a myriad of ways to tackle the problem. I'll stop there.
We've got a bit of time for questions, but I wanted to ask, really, driving private sector investment into this. Christina, what would you consider one of the things that we could do as private sector organizations to open this up?
I think what Angelo said was really poignant on that. It's what all of us said, but I think he said it the most specifically about the private sector. You need to speak the language of the private sector, and the private sector needs to understand, quite frankly, what's in it for them, because in the end they need to make a profit. And so, for example, I think the Althelia model is really interesting, where they kind of have a landscapes approach where it's forest protection, but there's also some sustainable commodities in there. So I think, it's really simply, it's 2 things: speak their language, keep it simple, and just show them where the gain is for them while protecting the forest. Okay, that's great. Are there any questions from the audience for our... yes.
Hi, good afternoon. My name is Tasila Banda. I'm a technical advisor for REDD Plus in Uganda. I was expecting a colleague in front, but I don't know what happened. This is very interesting for the national program that we are working on. And The situation in Uganda, for example, is that most protection of forest is happening in national parks and forest reserves, and the highest rate of deforestation is happening in private lands. So private investment, seeing that the country has now reached a point where the national strategy is going to be launched next week on the 16th in the UNDP Pavilion, is going to be the implementation stage. And so we are looking into that private sector investment space where some of the options that have come out of the national strategy for implementation can be funded. So that's probably what you would have heard from the national government if they were present today. But I do have a question for you, the lady in the middle who is smiling at me. When you talk about the standards, at the stage that we've reached in terms of developing forest carbon, obviously we agree, all of us, that there are several methodologies and standards. And you mentioned that we need to standardize this so that we don't have the complexities that are bringing the mistrust basically on the market. My understanding is that these methodologies were developed to take care of the different situations and ecosystems wherever one might want to develop their program. So I haven't read your paper, unfortunately. So I'm wondering how you imagine that playing out, given that if you look at the biome, for example, in Africa, we have miombos, we have tropical high forests. I mean, Uganda, for example, has maybe 4 different ecosystems, and each one has different species of trees which contribute differently towards the total carbon that you are able to generate at the end of the day and get your result based. So I'll be very curious to see how we could standardize those. Of course, standardizing helps remove a lot of the hurdle, but I don't know how it can actually practically play out in reality.
Thank you so much for your questions. And yeah, your colleague was very sad he couldn't be here. He's tied up in the negotiations. So to your question, no, we completely see that, and obviously there's different things that need to be measured, but also different countries might have different capabilities to measure. But when you look at financial accounting, right, you have companies that maybe make teddy bears, and then you have companies that are steel producers, and you have banks who don't produce anything at all. And yes, yet they all use, well, you know what I mean, they all use the same accounting standard. So it's about the principles, and then obviously within the principles there will be some differentiation, and somebody has tropical rainforests, and somebody else has savannas, and that's not really what it's about, as long as all the principles are agreed, so that the data that comes out of it can be understood by everyone, and also that you're really clear about what you are measuring. And what we were more referring to is, when you look, for example, at reference levels, right? The UNFCCC, in one way, is relatively vague about what kind of reference levels you can use. You can use historic, you can, do business as usual. The FCPF, on the other hand, is very, I would argue, strict. They only allow historical reference levels, so does the GCF. And the VCS kind of allows historic and business as usual. So, I mean, to be honest, if someone had just walked in who doesn't know REDD+, he doesn't even know what I'm talking about here, right? But even people who know what I'm talking about are probably saying, yeah, why are there 5 different ways of doing reference levels? And that's kind of what we're getting at. It's about agreeing how you do them, so that everybody comes from the same page, and then you construct whatever you have, your data around that. And, obviously there need to be some kind of, again, if a country isn't quite there yet, they need to be helped and everything, but it's about having that common standard that you start with. Does that make sense?
And then the second question I had was for Angelo about private sector. Making sure that we are able to present our technical papers in a way that we are able to understand. I think we always from the technical side, we always struggle with that because technocrats are technocrats and they have these terminologies in place because that's what they have. I would be very happy to find out, even from the audience, who has done it, who has translated these things into simple or into business like literature that the private sector is interested in hearing. Maybe they have something, the ecosphere people have received some of those examples that we'll be able to look at. Thank you.
Okay, only related to the question who had to do the translation. In our experience, normally in the private sector, there are people that know the technical aspect of this kind of issues related to the REDD+. Not a lot of people, but in some cases, only one person can do the difference and can support the public sector to do the translation, because they are working inside the private sector and they can explain the needs much better than us. So in this case, we spend a lot of time looking inside the companies who is possible to understand, because in some cases they are participating in this kind of conference. So after that, they have to talk with the specific decision maker inside the private sector, but obviously using the current language that they know. Yeah. So here, I think that the better situation is to find this kind of people that know the specific words to explain the benefits of REDD+, and in some cases not use it, the REDD+ concept in the front of the communication.
So I was just going to add something, which was a point Angela made previously about the private sector, which I think is really important, in part as a response to that question. I work for Nature Conservancy now, but I spent 12 years working in the private sector on a lot of these issues. And I think what I heard from Angela was actually what's really important is to get the private sector involved as early as possible. If you're at a point where you're translating something for them, it's probably kind of too late. That's not necessarily helpful for where you are right now, but going forwards, that would be sort of my advice. Bring them in as early as possible.
You have to, Angelo said it, you've always got to be translating to the right audience, and there's different kinds of private sector. So there's private sector in country, and absolutely involving them early and making sure that we're translating into language they know and understand. I think having the common principles and common metrics that Christina talks of will be helpful at every level. But then there's the private sector, if we're talking about attracting the private sector to actually pay for ecosystem services. And that's where, sadly, we are also back to the demand question, which, I think is where we have to think, well, what's in it for them, right? At the moment, it's not clear. And that's a really important metric that we have to tackle. Maybe there will be some reasons that it's in their interest. That's why we're trying to say, well, actually, you need to kind of take it to the consumer level and to shareholders and investors, because ultimately it is the right thing to do to manage their business risks and their opportunities, but they're not doing it. So I'd say that's, you have to be talking to the right private sector as well.
Are there any further questions? Otherwise, I've got one. Lisa, I want to follow on from what you were talking about. I think mainstream financial people, my background is in finance, forest is not on the radar. It's just not. I don't know, is anybody in here from a bank or anything? It's not, and it seems to be. And so what can we as an organization, and when I say this is CMI, one of our things is to provide thought leadership and finance. But when you speak to the main financial people or the bankers, they're all for carbon markets, or they're all for markets. But as soon as you start talking about what is it about forestry, what is it about that barrier of how can we have, if we looked at the earth as a business and a business, you said, okay, we've got a problem. A third of one of our biggest business problems is here in forestry. Then wouldn't you, as a private sector company, say, right, what are we going to do to solve that? Which is where I see people, an organization like CMI, we have, what can we do to drive investment and to drive demand, but maybe to make it more attractive? Is it coupling only with sustainable supply chains, or is it a standalone product?
I think there's a number of answers to the question, but it's the right question. I think the risks and opportunities just aren't really understood. We know that nature and forests in particular, and the ecosystem services they provide, are just horribly undervalued in our economy historically. Never mind CO2. Right? So we don't pay for many of the ecosystem services that we actually use. That's probably why we're massively in overdraft. And I think for me and for what we do, that's where a price on carbon as a proxy for a range of different services is a very effective metric. I've worked on carbon markets and carbon pricing for a very long time, since the 90s. But, it comes back to we have to build trust and confidence that if we're putting a price on something, that it's going to have the desired effect, that we can be confident that a ton of emissions reductions are actually taking place, that it's permanent, and that it's been done with the full participatory consent of everybody concerned. And I think that's where we have to have the standards. But, for me, putting the price on the CO2 emissions is a very effective way to bring to light many of the other ecosystem services and economic benefits of forests. I think that supply chains are really, really important. I'd like to see many more companies investing in supply chains. I worked in the energy sector for a long time. Worked on the energy transition for major oil and gas companies, and I feel like we're at a similar place that we were for renewables like 15 or 20 years ago in land use. Huge potential, maybe the next frontier of investing, but we need to be a bit more creative about the tools we're using. So, for renewable energy, people were very happy to buy renewable energy certificates and sign virtual power purchase agreements to give a signal to the market to help fund and lower the cost of projects. And we don't seem to have that same mindset in the land use sector. People aren't out there, as much as I'd like them to be, buying an ecosystem credit or signing an ecosystem protection purchase agreement, which would enable them to actually really invest in the ecosystem that is going to sustain their business long term. To me, it makes perfect sense. How are you going to actually create your products and have your value chains and your commodity supply into the future if you don't have those systems that you rely on? It's a rainforest. The clue is kind of in the title. We need rain to grow crops, but there seems to be a real disconnect. So I think there's a lot we can learn actually about how we did this in renewables, and apply maybe some of those techniques and tools into a more innovative and interesting way for people to get behind investment in this space. So I think we have to be creative.
Yes, sorry, this gentleman first, and then afterwards, hi.
Andrew Hedges, Norton Rose, Fulbright. Thanks, everyone. I guess I'm trying to be positive about everything I'm hearing, and I love the idea of Lisa's idea of sort of embedding the solution within products. I love the idea of trust. I actually think a lot of the complexity in the various standards comes from the fact that people were trying to create trust, because we're talking about permanence, we're talking about all of these things. And ultimately, consumers probably don't want to think about that. So we need, for Lisa's idea, anyone who buys that product to just see that tick of approval and not have to think about reference levels or anything further than that. But then that says to me, well, trust comes from results. And that's ultimately my question is perhaps to you, Chris. Things like the FCPF, do you think they're getting closer to actually having successful implementation at scale, which means that we will get to a point where someone will say, well, actually, look, there's programs that have worked. As long as we've got a product that ticks the box that is similar or that, then it must be pretty good because we've shown that this works. Whereas it feels for a long time we've been talking theoretically it should work, but we haven't actually proven it yet at scale.
This is a personal reflection. the FCPF has been hugely successful in a number of very, I think, understood ways. One of those is building, I think, a huge amount of trust that feels, to me at least, it has reached a tipping point into action. So I personally am really optimistic that the FCPF is going to really get moving in the next couple of years, and in fact in the next 6 months or so. The other, I suppose, I mean, that is right. I think, I don't know what the numbers are, but I'm sure it's more than 100 million tons or so of credits from forestry projects in the sort of voluntary market have been issued and retired. So there's some degree of at scale starting in a cumulative way to emerge from the voluntary market. But I think what we would all now love to see is that kind of step change from the sort of 100,000 hectares to the jurisdictional, to the landscape, where the FCPF and some of the work that some of the other bilateral donors are looking to really kind of get cracking with. Certainly talking to the governments that are supporting the FCPF and some of those other bilateral programs, they really recognize that sort of dilemma that you just posed, and the need to show at scale results between now and 2020 in a few places to build confidence going into the next NDC cycle. And that's certainly an area where we're really focused in supporting as well.
Hi, Margaret-Ann. Hi, Michael Radomir, Code Red. Very much appreciated all the comments, all the panelists. Learned a lot, even as a specialist in the sector. We are focused on REDD Plus and trying to navigate some of these issues. And some of my observations, I wonder what you feel as a panel, is that sometimes REDD Plus is seen as an offset and something that perhaps is cheap. And there's, people discredit it sometimes in that sense when it's the money's coming from the compliance markets and offsets within compliance markets, which could be a really important part of the financing of avoided deforestation and other land use emissions reductions and sequestration. But of course we'd like to have additional finance for all of this, and that would be great, but we may not get that. And on the basis both that we may not get that, and anyway, even if we didn't get it or we did get it, it still provides the global economy a very low cost opportunity for emissions reductions. And that is an opportunity, and we shouldn't be afraid of that, and we should make that message clear. And I think that's important to build the trust back into REDD Plus, that we put across those messages.
Thank you.
Can I just say to that, I mean, coming from the oil and gas sector for a long time, I've worked on geological carbon capture and storage projects as well, and I think for me it's always worth us highlighting the fact that, this is, we've had a long time for the R&D into trees, so we know that they definitely store carbon. And, we get a lot of co-benefits. You don't get so many co-benefits. You don't get so many co-benefits burying CO2 in the desert. Now, that's not to say that technology isn't important. It is, and it has the applications, but we can sequester at scale, and we need to be able to talk, I think you're right, very confidently about the fact that we need to increase the world's capacity to handle carbon. We're at that stage now. And we can't do that without our forests and the land use sector at large. So I think we need to speak more positively about the fact that we get a lot of benefits for a small investment in this space.
Thank you. We can close up, but I would want to extend that. Do you not think that the new rules, the new FSB Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosure rules, or not rules, recommendations that have come out, do you not think that those will influence the way that corporates will be looking at their investment portfolio? Why I say this is there's a lot of reporting standards, but none of those are for qualitative financial data, and these are And it's my understanding that the CDP, the Carbon Disclosure Project, is now going to, from 2018, have those, is asking for those to be embedded into their reporting. So how are companies going to do that? And does any of the panel, I'm not trying to put you guys on the spot, so much as I see that they're signaling, do you agree, or am I just...
Yeah, I mean, I think that the TCFD standards and the whole process around transparency of financial risk from climate change has obviously been, you know, hugely transformational in the way we approach climate change from the corporate sector and from the financial sector. You know, it does apply to all companies in the space and investors. So hopefully there will be some rigor brought to the way that we think about the land use sector risks and opportunities. But at the moment, you know, we have thousands of companies completing their CDP data, and only a few hundred completing supply chain CDP disclosure. And you know, I was even surprised to realize that when you think about Scope 3 emissions in the CDP context, it doesn't actually include the land use sector. So investors can't possibly know yet what the real risks and opportunities are if they're relying just on the CDP report. So I think there's a lot more to do to really, again, bring integration and to treat these emissions equally, actually. The atmosphere doesn't care whether the CO2 is coming from the land use sector or the energy sector, but so we need to think about it in the right way.
Yeah, okay, thank you. I wasn't trying to get off topic so much as how do we join up the dots to show or create a clear investment path, and I think there's nothing better than regulation or the thought of regulation for large companies. Any other further questions? Otherwise, thank you so much. If you guys could give a round of applause to our panelists, they were awesome. Thanks, guys.